Okay. Ferris, chapters 15, 16, and 17. Okay, we're going to read 3. Pinky was in the paper the next day. I bet she was. According to the article, a young child in a black cloak had gone unaccompanied into the Buford Milford Savings and Loan and approached the desk of Irene Milford. "I thought the child was a trick-or-treater," Mrs. Milford was quoted as saying. "I guess I lost track of my seasons. In any case, she resembled a vampire of some sort, and so I started looking for some candy." Apparently, Mrs. Milford had dug around in the top drawer of her desk until she located a piece of butterscotch. But alas, the article ended, the offer of a single butterscotch candy enraged the child, and it was at this point that she started screaming about how she was attempting to rob the bank. Eventually, it became necessary to call the police. Ferris's father read the words aloud in a tone of awe. They were in the kitchen, Ferris, her mother, her father, Boomer. It was morning, and sunlight was shining on the glossy leaves of the magnolia tree, and Ferris was drinking coffee again. "My goodness," said Ferris's father when he finished reading. "Well," he cleared his throat, "I suppose it's nice to have such a full accounting of what happened, what with Pinky herself being unwilling to disclose any details." Ferris's mother was sitting at the kitchen table. I can't imagine how her mother has reacted, right? With her hands in her lap. She was staring straight ahead. "I really don't know what to do with her," she said. "Ted was a bit of a wild child," said Ferris's father. "Yes," said her mother, still staring straight ahead. "And where is he now?" "In the basement?" "Exactly." "Can I have the newspaper?" said Ferris. "I want to read it to Charisse." "I doubt it will help her heart any," said Ferris's mother. Ferris stood up and took the paper from her father's outstretched hand. Boomer stood up too. He wagged his tail, he looked in the direction of the pantry, and then he looked at the door to the basement, and then he looked back to the pantry again. Clearly, Boomer was hoping that Ferris would get some peanuts and take them down to Uncle Ted, which was a good idea. She and Billy Jackson were going to need help lighting the chandelier. They needed an adult, a quixotic adult. Quixotic meant exceedingly unrealistic and foolish, like someone who would quit their job to paint the history of the world. So if you're doing your vocabulary right now, quixotic, page 103, exceedingly unrealistic and foolish, like someone who would quit their job to paint the history of the world. That part's not the definition, right? The definition is exceedingly unrealistic and foolish. In other words, someone like Uncle Ted. "Actually," said Ferris, "I think I'll go show Uncle Ted the article first." She went to the pantry and got out the jar of peanuts. Boomer wagged his tail faster. "If Ted wants peanuts," said her mother, "why doesn't he come up here and get them himself?" "The way I look at it," said her father, "is that we should eat everything we can before the raccoons take over the house and beat us to the punch." "The raccoons have already taken over the house," said her mother, metaphorically speaking. Ferris went down the basement steps carefully, the newspaper under one arm, the jar of peanuts in both hands, and Boomer close at her heels. "Uncle Ted," she called. Ted, unshaven and still in his bathrobe, oh, I hope he's taking a bath, right? Appeared at the bottom of the stairs, smiling up at her. "I brought you some peanuts," said Ferris. "Still feel bad for telling Aunt Shirley about the foot." "Ah," said Ted, the peanuts of repentance. "Thank you, honey." He took the jar from her and unscrewed the lid and poured a stream of peanuts into his mouth. Boomer barked, so Ted tossed him a peanut. "Are you growing a beard?" said Ferris. "I am," said Ted. "It gives me a certain painterly gravitas, don't you think?" "I don't know. What's gravitas?" "It means dignity, honey. Something I am in the dire need of right now." Ferris thought the beard made Ted look less like a dignified painter and more like a prophet lost in the desert. "Come on over here," said Ted. "I'll show you how I've progressed. I'm painting the second foot." Ferris walked over to the canvas and stood beside Uncle Ted. The second foot was at a good distance from the first, but it was similar looking, lumpy, disembodied. "That's good," said Ferris. She thought for a while about what to say next. Do you know, who the feet belong to? Uncle Ted stared at the canvas. Not yet, he said. I'm sure it will come to me. Ferris handed him the newspaper. She said, there's an article in there about Pinky. It doesn't use her name, but it's definitely her. I thought you might want to read it. Ted put down the peanut jar. He took the paper and snapped it open and held it out and away from him. He read with a serious look on his face until he got to the butterscotch. But alas, Uncle Ted read aloud, the offer of a single butterscotch candy enraged the child. He started to laugh. He laughed so hard that he had to bend over and put his hands on his knees. Uncle Ted in his bathrobe with his hair sticking straight up and the peanut crumbs on his face and tears of laughter rolling down his cheeks and into his prophet beard was an unsettling sight. Boomer barked at him in a scolding way. Ted stood up. Whoo-wee, he said. He wiped at his eyes. Thank you, honey. I don't know when a newspaper has cheered me up more. He handed the paper back to Ferris. And I do need to laugh. Yes, I surely do, for my poor heart is broken. Because of Shirley? Said Ferris. Yes, honey, because of Shirley. I find that I cannot live without her. She's necessary to me. Ferris thought about Shirley, frosted and sparkling, small and twirling. Nothing about her seemed particularly necessary. Who can explain the human heart? Said Ted. Oh, hearts. Cherisse's heart. Charisse is taking those pills Dr. Trench gave her, Ferris said, but I don't think she feels that good. She sleeps and sleeps. I'm worried. Uncle Ted smiled at her. Honey. He put his hands on her shoulder, one hand on each shoulder. It was the same way Reverend Mulberry put his hands on her when he blessed her in the communion line. The smell of peanuts and bathrobe and oil paints filled the air. Boomer wagged his tail. Uncle Ted looked deep into Ferris's eyes. He said, I don't understand any of it. I truly don't. The world is a mystery to me. But yet here we are, and our hearts keep on beating. They keep wanting things, don't they? Which wasn't really a blessing. But still, it managed to seem like one to Ferris because it gave her a way to talk about Charisse and the ghost. She said, Uncle Ted, Charisse has been seeing a ghost. Oh, Lordy, said Uncle Ted, and the ghost talked to her. I see, said Ted. Please continue. The ghost wants something. Ted nodded. Uh-huh. He kept his hands on her shoulders. Charisse said the ghost wants the old chandelier lit. I'm going to get the candles and Billy Jackson is going to help. 40 candles. We can do that part, but the ladder and the matches and the lighting, we'll need an adult for that. So what this ghost wants is more light? Said Ted. Yes, said Ferris. That's just exactly my kind of project, said Ted. His hands were still on her shoulders. He was smiling, and Ferris smiled back at him. Boomer pushed his way in between them, wagging his tail furiously, whacking Ferris in the knees. More light, said Uncle Ted. That's what we're all about around here. More light is good. Chapter 16. I'll tell you what's going to happen, said Ferris's mother when Ferris and Boomer came back up from the basement. We're going to work to set Pinky on a different path. That's what's going to happen. Ferris's father had left for the office, and outside the kitchen window, the birds were singing a complicated morning song. There was a blue jay in the branches of the magnolia tree. Sit down, said her mother. Ferris sat down. First, said her mother, we're going to get Pinky her own library card. Okay, said Ferris. After the library, we'll go to Bowie Hardware and have Pinky apologize to Mr. Bowie and return the pliers. Futile. That was the milk vocabulary word that seemed to apply to this plan of her mother's. It was pointless, that's what futile means, pointless, to try and reform Pinky. Besides, Ferris had other more important things to tend to, like candles and ladders and ghosts. She opened her mouth to say no, or to say so. No, said her mother. She's your sister. You're coming with me. Okay, said Ferris. It was also futile to argue with her mother. Pointless, futile, pointless. When it was time to leave, Pinky came down the stairs without her cloak. She was wearing a pair of red shorts and a blue striped top. Her hair was combed. She looked almost normal. Ferris wasn't fooled, though. Where's your cape? Said Ferris. None of your business, said Pinky. Let's go. She can't talk because her two teeth are out, right? Thelma Atkins was the head librarian at the Bingham Memorial Library. Mrs. Atkins had a gold-plated tag pinned to her blouse that read, Mrs. Atkins, head librarian. Mrs. Atkins wore her glasses on a chain around her neck, but Ferris had never seen her actually put the glasses on. It was more like they were there for decoration. Good morning, Thelma, said Ferris's mother. Am I starting to get crooked? Sorry. We're here to get Pinky a library card. Who? Said Mrs. Atkins. Mrs. Atkins did not approve of nicknames, and she would not put them on library cards. Ferris's library card read Emma Wilkie. Sometimes when Ferris looked at it, she wondered who it belonged to. Eleanor Rose, said Ferris's mother. We're here for a library card for Eleanor Rose. She pushed Pinky forward toward Mrs. Atkins. How old are you, dear? 6, said Pinky. Well now, said Mrs. Atkins. She bent down and put her hands on her knees and looked Pinky in the eye. Ferris felt like this was probably a mistake. 6 years old, said Mrs. Atkins, is not old enough for a library card. In my library, you have to be able to read to acquire a library card, and you, my dear, will learn how to do that when you attend first grade. I can read now, said Pinky in a voice of deadly calm. It's true, said Ferris's mother. She taught herself, somehow, when she was 4. Mrs. Atkins stood up. She released a disbelieving breath through her nostrils. Well, she said, we'll see about that, won't we? She didn't sound very nice. I think most librarians are nice. They shouldn't be mean, right? I don't know why this one's mean. She turned and pulled a thick book off a library cart. Hans Christian Andersen's Complete Fairy Tales. Mrs. Atkins flipped through the volume until she found a particular page. Now then, she said to Pinky. She handed her the book. Why don't you read that to me? It was the story of the little match girl, and Pinky read it through without stumbling or hesitating. True, some of the words sounded funny because of Pinky's missing teeth, but she knew every word. Ferris's mother had edged away and was looking at the new arrivals display, but Ferris stood transfixed as Pinky read. Transfixed means frozen in horror or astonishment. Pause and write it down. Transfixed, frozen in horror or astonishment. Because who knew what was going to happen in the showdown between Mrs. Atkins and Pinky? Do you think she's going to be mad, the librarian? Because here she's like trying to prove her that she can't get a library card, and now Pinky's kind of proving her wrong, right? Pinky slammed the book shut when she was done reading. That story, she said. My goodness, said Mrs. Atkins, who looked impressed but unwilling to admit it. That girl doth robbed a bank, said Pinky. I beg your pardon, said Mrs. Atkins. That silly girl should have robbed a bank, said Pinky. She should have done something to rescue herself. I can't talk with her list. Well, said Mrs. Atkins, perhaps. And then, for the first time ever, Ferris saw Mrs. Atkins raise her glasses up to her eyes. She did it so she could study Pinky. She stared at her as if she were a particularly interesting specimen of some sort. That girl should have acted, said Pinky. Mrs. Atkins rocked back on her heels. She lowered the glasses. She said, I would be happy to issue a library card to such an excellent reader and, original thinker. Would you like some assistance in selecting your books? Maybe, said Pinky. She crossed her arms over her chest and stared somewhere past Thelma Atkins. Ferris had to admit that she felt just the tiniest bit proud to know Pinky. Talk about formidable. Yeah, I wouldn't want to go head-to-head with Pinky. I think she might win over me. In the end, Pinky left with 2 nonfiction books. One about deadly snakes. That might not be a good choice. And the other about Houdini. Ferris checked out Anne of Green Gables. Awesome book if you haven't read it. Even though she had already read it, and her mother selected a biography of Abraham Lincoln in an effort to shore up her moral fortitude. Speaking of moral fortitude, said her mother, we will now go to Bowie Hardware. Pinky, you will go in there and return those pliers and issue an apology. Pinky said nothing. She was studying a full-page picture of a rattlesnake in her Snakes You Do Not Want to Meet book. When they arrived at Bowie Hardware, Pinky walked into the store without complaint. She marched up to the counter and pulled the pliers from the pocket of her shorts and handed them to Mr. Bowie. "What's this?" said Mr. Bowie, taking the pliers from her. "I thole him," said Pinky. "How's that?" said Mr. Bowie. He fiddled with his hearing aid. "I thole them," shouted Pinky. "Thank you so much," said Mr. Bowie. "Whatever you're saying, I appreciate it very much. What a handsome pair of pliers." "I'm thorry," said Pinky. "She said she's sorry," said Ferris's mother in a very loud voice. "She stole the pliers and used them to pull a few of her own teeth, which is why it's difficult to understand her." "Heavens," said Mr. Bowie. "That must have hurt." Pinky shrugged. Mr. Bowie winked at her. He bent down and disappeared below the counter, and then he slowly reappeared holding 3 lollipops. A red one, a green one, and a yellow one. He handed the red lollipop to Pinky. "All is forgiven," said Mr. Bowie. He held out the green and yellow lollipops to Ferris and said, "Here you go, my dear. I remember when you were born." "You do?" said Ferris. "Yes, indeed. I was at the fair that day. It was all very exciting." "Oh, it sure was," said Ferris's mother. Ferris reached out to take the lollipops from Mr. Bowie. He wrapped his warm and calloused hand around her fingers and pulled her closer. "If you wouldn't mind, could you give this other sweet, the yellow one, to your grandmother from me? "You want me to give a lollipop to Charisse?" said Ferris. "Yes," said Mr. Bowie, "please. She has been breaking hearts since the day she came into the world. She has certainly broken mine. Give her my love." Ferris's mother sighed loudly. "Thank you, Mr. Bowie," she said. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Mr. Bowie waved his hand through the air dismissively. "It's all inconvenience," he said, "and then suddenly it's over, and you find yourself thinking that you wouldn't mind a little inconvenience." Pinky exited the hardware store. The door shut behind her with a loud bang. "Do you sell candles?" Ferris said to Mr. Bowie. "How's that?" said Mr. Bowie. I don't think he can hear a thing. "Candles!" shouted Ferris. "Lights? We sell flashlights, patio lights, and lanterns," said Mr. Bowie. Ferris's mother turned to her and said, "What in the world do you need candles for?" And this was when Ferris realized for the first time that the chandelier wasn't going to get lit without her mother's approval. "Go on and give that sweet to Charisse," said Mr. Bowie. "Promise me you will now." "I promise," said Ferris. "Give it to her with my regards," said Mr. Bowie, "and also my love." Oh, I think he's got a little sweet spot for Charisse. I don't know what Ferris was thinking. Of course he's going to have to ask her mom and dad. You can't just let